Hi. How's it going? It's good to see you. I want to invite you to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 10. We'll be there at some point in the next 3 hours. And so I want to give you what you need. It's New Year. How's everybody doing? Okay. Ted Nugent here tonight, or what was that? That's great. We'd love to hand you a Bible, and the page number's there on the screen. But before we do that, we have all sorts of ground to cover. And if you're joining us for the first time, we're thrilled that you've joined us tonight. And we're going to be celebrating communion later on. And communion is this ancient, actually terribly mysterious ritual involving bread and a cup. And for us, it's this way that we center ourselves around Jesus. And our understanding is that the world is broken, fractured, it's fallen apart, and that God has not given up on the world, but has set about to rescue the world from itself. And He's done this through Jesus, dying on a cross, rising from the dead, leaving an open tomb. And so for us, we take this bread and dip it in this cup as a way of reflecting on our own brokenness, our own sin, our own failure, and God's grace and mercy to put us back together because we need it. Would you agree with me? I got a little support on that. So it's this way that we center ourselves, and we'd like to begin 07 with going through this experience together. But before we do that, we're going to basically turn this room into a living room, and I'm going to have a conversation with our friend Rachel here. And so we're going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to interview her, and then from there I want to offer a few thoughts based on what you hear her say from Luke chapter 10, and then from there we'll go into an extended time of prayer, singing, and you can come and take communion whenever you want. Sound good? Okay. Now, we have one of our very own, Rachel Pater, with us tonight. So everybody, good evening, Rachel. Good evening. And you're going to hear a bit of her story. And one of the things that we are learning when you're part of a community is that nobody can journey alone. It doesn't work. Being a Christian doesn't work alone. And so one of the things we're learning is that to be a church, the kind of church Jesus had in mind, means that we suffer together, but we celebrate together, and we share our stories often. Because often what happens is we hear one person's story, and we hear a bit of our own story in there. We hear God's story. And so tonight, as Rachel shares a bit of her journey, she sits out here each week. She's been a part of Marseille for several years now, from the beginning, from way back. And so as you listen to her story, maybe one of the questions I'm always asking, and you can ask, is simply, God, where are you in her story? What does it mean for my story? And what does it tell me about the big story that God is telling in the world? So, Rachel, why don't you start with kind of what happened last year for you? June, I believe it was.
A lot of things came together last year, things that I've been learning at Mars and in this community for a long time. And we had started going through the new Exodus series, and many of you may remember these folders. And we kind of went through this 4-part section using... Thanks. We were using Egypt as an illustration of... basically an illustration of sin, in that sin can become both personal and relational between people, but also rooted in society, and that it can become systemic. And we looked at this illustration of Egypt as essentially an anti-kingdom, as a kingdom that had come to oppress so many, and so many had fallen to the bottom of the heap and were feeling the weight of this oppression. And we looked at verse after verse of people crying out under the weight of this oppression, crying out to God, poor and oppressed people crying out for help. And Rob mentioned that there are over 2,000 verses in the Bible that deal with poor and oppressed people. And luckily we didn't go through all of them that day. But we did jump to the...
That's an awesome idea, by the way.
We jumped around a little bit and looked at the New Testament, and how when Jesus came, He was obsessed with the marginalized and the poor and the oppressed. and he never sidled up to those in power or the power players of the day or the popular people of the day. He was always concerning himself with those that had been crying out and were under some sort of weight. And the question as we journeyed through this together that really got me, that I wrote down and actually still have, is as we got to the end, Rob asked, "Do you hear the cry of the oppressed? If you don't, could it be because you are a part of a system that is oppressing someone else?" And when I heard this question, to be honest, at first I was a little bit offended. I considered myself a very just person and had always thought that I had a sense of justice and that I could never be a part of a system that would oppress someone else. I grew up with 2 older brothers, so I felt from a very young age I knew what justice was and that I wasn't receiving it much of the time. And I remember specifically when I was about 6 or 7 learning to read, reading this book, The Berenstain Bears, No Girls Allowed. And some of you girls may have been put through the same trauma that I was in reading this book, in this part where Sister Bear just is walking through the woods and wants to be a part of the Boys Town Bear Club, and Brother Bear puts up a sign that says "No Girls Allowed." And I remember each time the pages on this book are just tattered because each time I would get there, I was just so angry and would just cry, and I would just be like, "Oh, Brother Bear!" Like just this sense of sort of injustice that wasn't right that he left her out. So by age 7, I pretty much had it figured out, injustice on the whole. But as I was thinking about this question, do you hear the cry of the oppressed? And started wrestling with it, that this question lingered. And I remember at the time listening to a Patty Griffin song, and she sings, "Nothing is louder to God's ears than a poor man's sorrow." And I'm a pretty linear thinker, so I thought, obviously we have a God who is just obsessed with the oppressed, with the poor, and with the marginalized. And I claim to be a follower of this God. So why then can I not hear the cry of the poor and the oppressed? And I remember looking back in college, I worked for a local world relief organization, and my only job was basically to take these figures of countries and their illiteracy rates and their poverty rates and to translate them into paragraphs and prose just to make it a little bit more accessible to people, basically to humanize the situation that is happening around the world. And I remember writing about countries that have 60% poverty rates and even higher illiteracy, and even through that work, I remember thinking I was never really shocked or amazed, and I never really felt anything for these people. They were just statistics, and it was just a job. And looking back on it, Shane Claiborne, a contemporary sort of revolutionary who spoke here a few months ago, and he works in downtown Philadelphia, he says that the great tragedy of the church is not that rich Christians do not care about the poor, it's that they do not know the poor. And I was honest with myself at that moment, I didn't know anyone who was poor or who was oppressed or even anyone who was illiterate. And looking back, I see sort of where there was that disconnect, and that's not that surprising that I didn't feel in my heart for these people because I had no face of poor and oppressed for myself.
And so it's around this time, May, June, that you're graduating from college, from Calvin. Mm-hmm. Apparently, that's in Grand Rapids somewhere?
Around here.
A little bit of... Yes, Calvin. So you had a great experience at Calvin. You're graduating from Calvin, and it's that time where you're either supposed to get a job or do something like that. And when you and I first communicated, you told me you kind of had this choice sitting in front of you when you graduated. Why don't you tell everybody a bit about that?
As I was nearing the end of my 5 years at Calvin,
Well done.
Sorry, Mom and Dad. all the prospective teachers were kind of looking for jobs, and most at Christian schools, many in the suburbs. And for some of these jobs, there would be stacks of applications 200 deep. And I remember thinking, that it would be almost impossible to stand out in a crowd like that, and that I felt that if I was going to teach this fall, that it would be in a place very different. So I ended up taking a job for which there was one applicant, and
you,
myself, and started teaching in September at an alternative high school to the Grand Rapids Public Schools for Grand Rapids Public School dropouts.
And why don't you tell us a bit like where it's located and give us a sense of what the school is like?
The school is on Jefferson and Franklin, the corner there, and if you ever drive by and are looking around and thinking, there's only a warehouse here, there's no school, that's it. It's a converted warehouse with only 2 windows. And the first day they told me to expect between 5 and 40 kids. So can't really lesson plan for something like that. But chaos was the first thing that I would use to describe it. Our kids come from mostly poverty-stricken families. Less than 5% of our kids have married parents. And many are on the brink of this cyclical nature of poverty they find themselves on, about to either graduate from or drop out of high school, and they're kind of staring down the barrel of that. I guess one of the other adjectives I would use to describe it is that it is at times a very dismal place, and that when I came, there weren't books and no curriculum, and a lot of the kids were just angry that they were there, and our kids have dropped out of school for a variety of reasons. One of which, many of our girls have had children themselves. Many of our boys and girls have been incarcerated for a number of years, but other just normal stuff like forgetting to go to class at their base school, they'll be sent to us. So all of these kids in one classroom, definitely at first I was listening to those lyrics, "All ye murderers and hellish crew," from that hymn, and I was just like, at first glance, that's kind of how you might describe my classroom. If you didn't know, some of these kids. There's one kid in particular that was just very angry, and if you saw him on the street, just a very big guy, and he would come into my class and he would sleep most days, and the only leverage I had with him is that he played basketball for another school. So one day I went up to that school to talk to his coach and pulled him aside and said, is Keith doing any work on the basketball court, because he's not doing any in my class? And the guy said, he was very upset, and he said, we're going to go in there and stand in the gym with our arms crossed and just shake our heads at him. So I'm here just dwarfed by this huge guy, and we just kind of both go in, and as Keith kind of rounds the bend, he comes up, and his mouth just drops. And later in class, when he asked me about it the next day, I didn't talk to him then. He asked me why I was there, and I just said, I care about you. I don't want you to fail out of this school. And he said something like, no one has ever done anything like that for me. And for a lot of these kids, even just a little bit of attention like that is something that they haven't had their whole lives. So there is a sense of duality in our classroom, a lot of energy, a lot of pain and suffering. These kids have been through more than I could imagine. But also amidst that sort of suffering, there is a pervasive just sense of joy. And sometimes I sit back before class starts and pretend like I'm doing something else so I can listen to them talk to each other. And just the way that they use language back and forth and are so quick with their banter, just the command they have over the language, and the energy that they have, there is a sense of joy there. And sometimes when people ask me about this school, I don't know how to describe it. So sometimes I'll just tell a story. And one thing that might illustrate some of their quickness and joy. This one girl, a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching, and there's a sign on my door that says, "If you are late, knock once and then wait, and I will come and get you." I was sick of the constant flow back and forth in my classroom. And so I'm teaching a lesson on probably some type of grammar, which if you ever have a crowd of teenagers, it's a real crowd pleaser. And I hear on my door just this bam, bam, bam. And I walk over and I open the door, and it was a relatively new student, and so I cut her some slack, and I said, "You know what, Bianca, why don't you try that again? Pretend like you're knocking on your grandma's door." Thought that was a nice little technique. I don't know.
They taught you that at Calvin.
Yeah. Little Calvin tip. That, you don't do weird stuff when your grandma's around. I don't know. But I closed the door, and a couple seconds later, I just hear bam, bam, bam. And I open the door again, and I look at this girl, and she just kind of is shrugging her shoulders and has this smirk on, and she says, "Miss P, my granny is deaf." So, sort of amidst this great suffering, there is definitely a sense of joy that I see from these kids every day.
And the basketball player, he's I think you said maybe in their service, he's 17 and works 2 jobs and lives alone.
Yeah.
So he's just on his own.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first times you and I corresponded, you told me about Kenny or Kenneth. I think that's a powerful way for us to understand the world that you live in. Can you tell us about Kenneth?
Kenneth was in 2 of my classes, so I saw quite a bit of him at first. And a couple weeks into school, he started coming to class less and less. And one of the reasons for this was he didn't want to be anywhere where someone could find him. And a few weeks into school, a gang came to our school and got in during lunch hour and had guns and were throwing bricks and saying, "Where is Kenny? Where is Kenny?" Looking for him with the intention to kill him. And 3 weeks, almost to the day after that, they found him. He was roller skating in Kentwood, and they shot him 6 times and killed him. And after that happened in my class, I remember the day after I got some sympathy cards and was floating them around my class, thinking that the kids would write to the family of Kenneth. And getting these cards back, every single one of the kids had written a note to Ken. And one of the girls had said, "Dear Ken, I didn't know you that well, but I hope heaven is better than this." Because for some of my kids, they live a little piece of hell every day here in Grand Rapids. And I just thought about the phrase that everyone kept throwing around, that he was in a better place. And usually we reserve that sort of talk for someone who has been suffering with cancer, for years and years. And finally you just say, "You know what, they've got to go somewhere else." But to use that same rhetoric with a child who is 16 and in good health, his funeral was held on his what would have been his 17th birthday. And we were doing a unit on stereotyping and racism, and I remember showing this clip of a movie called Hoop Dreams. It's a documentary of 2 kids who want to become NBA basketball players in Chicago, and it follows these kids along since they're in early middle school till they graduate college. And the mom of this one boy, Arthur Agee, she said on his 18th birthday that she was so proud that Arthur had graduated high school because he was the first one in their family to do so. But then she said, "I'm even more proud that he lived to be 18 because so many of his friends had not." And for many of my kids, they are living a very thin line between life and death. the response from people outside of the school was equally, I guess, as disturbing. A lot of people were shocked, but when they heard that Kenneth was in a gang, the tragedy was somehow lessened, that he sort of had what was coming to him. And as I thought about that, looking for the tragedy in this event, maybe the tragedy was earlier in that sometimes kids will come to my class and show me their arm, and they would have just gotten the tattoo of the gang they had just joined that day. And for a lot of these kids who have not been shown love their entire lives, a gang is more welcome and will give them more love, sometimes even than a church will. And I think that we found our tragedy in that kids would go to those extremes to feel a sense of love. A student wrote a poem soon after Kenneth was murdered, and I'll read a little bit of it. Sometime my days is dark like night, because in this world it's a constant fight. Some days I think why my days can't be bright. I smell life and death because it's all that's around. You tell me if you want a day without ambulance sounds. For many of my kids, they are living a little piece of hell, and they see life and death all around in a very clear way.
So, as somebody who's serious about doing what Jesus said to do and living the life that Jesus calls us to, what's happening inside of you? My wife will often say, "Oh no," she'll say, "I'm not trying to save the world. I'm trying to save myself from indifference." She'll say, I'm doing this to make sure my own soul doesn't become hard and indifferent." But what's happening inside of you? What's God shaping and doing inside of you through all this?
Sometimes people ask me, like, if I am scared to be at school, and sometimes I just want to brush it off, but there is a sense of danger there. But more dangerous to me would be to be in a place with the walls built up around myself that I had, and to not know that a place like this exists. And I think it is much more scary, the possibility of living a life of complacency. And I think the idea of being with people, not only just coming down to them in this sort of pithy act of charity, a one-time deal, but to be living with them is not only for them, but it's for us as well. And I think God writes us a story, the Bible, and He writes a story because I think we are supposed to be in that story, and it is scary to me that there are people who believe but do not join in the story.
Like in a room this size, I mean, I can only imagine. I can actually the resources, the talents, the passions, the energy, the desire to change the world. Like in terms of the school that you are in every day, dream for us. What can happen?
I think the easy thing is to say that we need money. And that is true to a certain extent, that there are resources that lacking in mine and many other schools around Grand Rapids. But more so than that, I think it would be easy to write off and to sort of quell our conscience with a check, which is also important, but that we need to be with the poor to see their faces and to recognize their story and to see our story in them, and to not see people as an other, but they are a part of us. And the fact that there are schools that exist like this, and people who have not been shown love their entire lives, it is not their problem, it is our problem, because these people are a part of our community, whether they go to this church, whether they go to church or not. And so I think there is a need to both use our resources, but also to come alongside someone. And I talked to some people after the first couple of services, and one of the things that I've seen in my students, I have one girl who has had a big sister for 10 years. This woman has stayed with her, and this woman has given her more love than her own mother has. So this sense of walking alongside just even one child, and I can see in this girl's disposition in class that it has just made a difference that she has a support system that essentially no one else in our class has. So I think, in a sense, acts of charity are good, but breaking down those walls so that we can consider their problem sort of our problem, and seeing their faith, so that when we see statistics of things around the world, that's not just their problem, it's our problem as well.
Well said. Well, I want to just have us reflect on a couple of words of Jesus, and then before we take communion, will you say a prayer?
Sure.
All right. Let's. I just want Rachel's words to kind of linger, just to kind of hang there in the air. But notice in Luke 10, as we head towards communion, we studied this story in Luke 10, verse 30. Jesus is involved in this discussion, and a couple months ago we went through kind of the background and the context of the day, but Jesus tells this story about a man, verse 30 in Luke 10, who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jerusalem was where the temple of God was, so that was like God central. Big deal. There's a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest, so a religious leader, a member of the religious establishment, happened to be going down the same road. So he'd obviously been serving in the temple, and now he was going home. And when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, another religious official, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. And we explored some of the reasons why they may have passed by. Nevertheless, verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Now, one of the things we've learned again and again is, besides the fact that Jesus is brilliant, there's often several things he's doing in any given story. And in this story, I think you could argue that Jesus is making a couple side comments here that are just genius, so inspired. A priest and a Levite would serve in the temple area, and part of the serving would be these giant sacrifices, ways of showing gratitude to God. And one of the things they would do is what's called a drink offering, where they would pour out wine as a way of saying, God, we are grateful for everything you give us. Even the grapes of the vine we are grateful for. And so as an act of public gratitude, the priest would pour out the wine. Oil, olive oil, would be mixed in with sacrifices as a way of saying, God, even the olives we acknowledge come from the earth, which comes from you. And so central to the work of a priest and a Levite in the temple were all of these sacrifices, which were ways of stopping and saying, I know where things come from. They come from you, God. Because often what can happen is our life becomes all about us. And so these sacrifices and the work in the temple was a way of helping people remember that life comes from God. Life is a precious gift. And when we take time to remember the source of all the things that come our way, it centers us and produces a certain health within us. It reminds us that it isn't all about us. So these two central elements that would often be used by the priests and Levites were oil and wine. So the priest and Levite, the professional religious people with the outfit, with the title, with the responsibility, serving their time in the temple, are leaving the temple, the house of God, the place where the religious stuff gets done. They pass by a man who's been beaten and left for half dead, who has these bleeding wounds, and they keep right on going. Now, there's some reasons why they may have gone. Nevertheless, they pass by. Samaritan comes along. Not a religious official, not somebody with the proper uniform credentials. This person doesn't know all the right Bible verses, stops and helps fix the man's wounds, attends to the man using oil and wine. Well, oil and wine, those are the tools of the trade of the priest and the Levite. And here you have just this ordinary, actually despised by them, Samaritan who's using the oil and the wine. Essentially, there's a story within a story. Jesus is essentially saying, who here is doing God's work? He's pushing who here is doing the work of God? The person who walked right on by, who supposedly is the one doing the work of God, or the person who's bent over the half-dead men with the oil and the wine? Perhaps the real question, maybe Jesus is doing on the side, is who's the real priest here? Who's the real priest here? The person with the outfit and the title and all of the public acknowledgement, or the person who sees somebody wounded and hurting and does something about it? Who's the real priest here? Or maybe there's even a second, larger theological thing that Jesus is pointing out here. Next slide. Essentially, everybody would have, God's in the temple. Of course, God is in the temple. That's where God resides. That's where God is. You go to the temple to do the religious stuff. But what does Jesus have? He has a Samaritan with the oil and the wine doing something very sacred and holy by the side of the road. Is God more in the temple than by the side of the road? No. And perhaps in this story, the priest and the Levite have missed the God of the temple, and the Samaritan is doing the work of God by the side of the road. If Rachel's story stirs you, if what she's up to, the path that Jesus has her on, if it stirs you in ways you can't explain, I would argue it's because what she is doing is holy, sacred work. And that all of us are called to be priests. Central to being a Christian is this awareness that the world is wounded. The world is lying half dead by the side of the road. And God is looking for people who will stop and take out some oil and wine. And it becomes a sacred, holy thing. God is in the temple. God is by the side of the road. God is in the classroom. God is in the cubicle. God is in the business meeting. God is in the library. God is in the carpool. God is on the sidewalk. God is in the apartment complex. Central to the life of a Christian is this awareness that every moment there are opportunities to take out the oil and wine and to stop and help a world that is wounded and broken. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12, and then we'll pray. And then there's this really powerful verse in Romans 12 that talks about essentially the posture we are to have in the world. We've been given this gift of life. Central to being a Christian is embracing the gift of life, not wasting any of it. And then central to being a Christian is this awareness that God has given us the gift of His Son, has given us life, the kind of life that goes on forever in this Jesus, who has taken death upon Himself, died on a cross, conquered this death, and then offers to us the kind of life that goes on forever. In Romans 12, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, verse 1, in view of God's mercy, essentially because of all that God has done for you, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. He takes some of that priest, Levite kind of language of temple and sacrifice. He says, now you give yourselves to the world, give yourselves to God in that sort of way. As we begin 2007, as we take communion, as we take this bread and dip it in this cup in remembrance of a Jesus who's given His body and His blood for us, what does it mean for you to be a priest in the world that you find yourself in? To show people what God is like. Where has God placed you? And what does it mean to show people what the love of Jesus is like? Or do you need to be in some other places? Have you walled yourself in? And so 2007 is a year when you go through the gate, you go past the wall, and you step into worlds up until now you haven't been in. What does it mean to offer yourself as a living sacrifice. So as we begin the new year together, as we take these elements that are around the cross here, around the stage, what does it mean to take out your oil and wine and to bandage the wounds of a world that needs it? Rachel, will you pray for us? And then we'll take communion.
God of the poor and of the oppressed, we ask that you would open our eyes to a world that is hurting, and that you would empower us to be priests not only in the church, but also alongside the road. God, we are blessed, and we want to be a blessing to people who need your light. Help us to be those hands and feet in your world. Amen.
I can't imagine anywhere I'd rather be than starting 2007 with you all here in Grand Rapids. It's going to be a good year. Do you have that sense? I sense our church is going to experience stuff we can't even imagine right now this year. If you want to know how you can get plugged in right now, there's all sorts of ways. It's called The Weekly, which will give you everything you need to know for the next 6 days. And maybe you're struggling with something and you think you're all alone, and this is the year when you need to get free, clean, sober, whatever it looks like, and you need to have the guts to say, I need help. And so there are all sorts of recovery groups and different support groups and different ways that we're walking with each other through difficult things. Or if you want to know about things we're doing in the city, things around the world, this Saturday we have a one-day seminar called Subverting the Empire. And those of you who are familiar with the work of Brian and Sylvia, they have just put out a book called Colossians Remixed. They're two scholars who happen to be married, and they have actually agreed to come and spend a day here teaching and answering questions. And so Subverting the Empire is this Saturday. I cannot recommend it enough. All sorts of other things going on. If you're giving an offering, there are joy boxes at the back. And then if you would like to talk with somebody or pray with somebody, there are always people down front, but then in that back corner is a prayer room, and there are people whose passion is simply to pray over people, is simply to say, what is it you're struggling with? Can we just talk to God about it? And I don't know, some of you might go, that's the last thing I'm doing. Trust me, these are great people who are just, how can I help? And so we have, back there in that room or anywhere down front here, we would love to get you connected in any way that we can. Now, before we do a benediction, I just want to clear up a few rumors in regards to next week. The rumors are true. So, some things you can't talk about, you just need to experience. So next week will be one for the ages. And now, my brothers and sisters, that got everybody talking. My brothers and sisters of the Mars Hill community, may you hear the invitation of God to take up the priestly vocation, to show the world what God is like. May you get out your oil and wine. May you find the person by the side of the road, whatever that looks like for you in the path Jesus has you on. And may you help